So at some point in your anime watching career, you've probably heard people argue about the ever so controversial anime School Days, either being labeled with the title of the worst anime ever or being a deconstruction of the harem genre. Probably the single most likely complaint you've heard people countlessly rant on and on about is how painful it is to watch School Days because the main character is a dickhead. However, today I'm going to play devil's advocate and try to explain how School Days might have some redeeming values despite the fact that it's almost universally disliked. This video will contain minor spoilers, but for a series such as this, it really won't matter. Possibly the biggest reason for why people dislike School Days is because the main character is portrayed as a walking douchebag with no regard to the girls he dates and only thinks with the lower half of his body. Now of course anyone with a sane mind would instantly dislike Makoto since, well, he is an asshole, but is that enough to justify saying that School Days is the worst anime ever? Not really. If anything, the show is doing a great job at making you dislike him. Since School Days is considered a harem series, I think people just have a linear expectation of what they think should happen. If you compare the show to almost any generic harem series, the one thing that's noticeably different is that the guy never takes advantage of the girls even when presented with multiple opportunities. Sure, it may be the morally right choice to pick, but it seems awfully unrealistic for a guy, a teenager nonetheless, to suppress his sexual urges when the girls themselves tempt him. I'm not saying every male teen would act this way, but given that the situation happens so often in anime, it's surprising we don't see more of what happens. So when School Days shows Makoto taking advantage of any girl he wants to be with, it may not be the morally correct decision, but it's far more realistic to see that happen rather than a guy not do anything at all. Of course, not every guy will act this way, I'm just saying that it's a very likely to happen circumstance. I think what people don't get is that School Days isn't a show about how happy, fun, or exciting relationships are. In fact, it's a show about how terrible people can be. If you think about it, are Makoto's actions non-logical? No, they aren't. As shown throughout the series, Makoto's only intent was to sleep with any girl he could get his hands with, and that's what he did. He wasn't looking for an actual relationship because he found it to be too tiring, and while some girls actually wanted to be with him, Makoto never realizes how much of a cunt he's being until most of the girls have left him. Makoto being portrayed as an asshole doesn't make him a bad character. Dislikable? Yes. Poorly written because you don't like his actions? No. I think that's the fundamental fault people have when criticizing School Days. Just because you don't like a character's actions doesn't mean they're poorly written. If their actions don't conflict with what their initial intent was, how can you say said character was badly written? If shows like Toradora and Clannad focus on the positives in being in a relationship, then School Days does the exact opposite. It shows how terrible relationships can be and how teenagers can be shitty people. Let's face it, not every relationship will end happily. Some people just aren't interested after a while and others grow apart. This is what School Days is all about. Granted, it may be slightly blown out of proportion, but that's what made the ending so cathartic. Sure, Makoto is extremely dislikable due to his unfaithfulness and infidelity, but think about it. Has any other show focused on infidelity this much besides School Days? Not really. In fact, I'd argue that School Days is one of the only shows that portrays romances in a negative light. Of course, most people will get angry. It's only natural to do so because it conflicts with the viewer's belief on how romance should work. Most people want romances in stories to work out so they themselves can be happy, but when a show comes along and conflicts with that idea, people get mad. People get disgusted. This is why School Days is adored by few and hated by many. If you can get past a flurry of emotions and blind hatred, you would notice that School Days is a show that's designed for most people not to like it, and that in itself makes the show interesting. Why? Because people aren't expecting characters to behave in such a despicable fashion. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the show is interesting because of the unexpected events, otherwise that would constitute as being edgy. What I am saying is that we don't normally get to see characters behave in such crude and vile ways. In a way, it's actually pretty surprising that we don't get to see characters in other harems act the way they do like in School Days. It's much more interesting to see characters act in a realistic manner as depicted in School Days rather than your generic harem where nothing is of consequence. This is what separates School Days from your typical harem series. It actually portrays a somewhat realistic situation that could possibly happen, albeit slightly overblown. If you believe that cheating on a partner is uncommon in the real world, you could not be any more wrong. Studies have shown that in the US alone, 57% of males in a relationship have admitted to infidelity at least once. I don't have to be an engineer to know that that is an outrageously high number. What about women, you ask? 54%. Now that you know the numbers, it puts School Days into perspective. There are no good or bad guys in the show, just extremely flawed teenagers. Flawed in the sense of their personality and not how they're written. Throughout the series, Makoto makes a plethora of bad decisions that quickly snowball into one gigantic mess, until the end where we can see how it affected other characters and what consequences it led to. Sekai feeling betrayed and angered to the point where she couldn't handle anymore until she finally lashed out. Kotonoha being desensitized to the whole situation and turning crazy. All of this was just a manifestation of one bad decision after another until the characters eventually broke down. This is why some people consider School Days to be a deconstruction of the harem genre. It takes conventional anime harem cliches and uses them in an unconventional method, effectively flipping the trope on its head. Evoking emotion is something School Days is well known for, and I think it relishes the fact that so many people have felt such a strong emotion for the series. Whether it was positive or negative, it didn't matter. In a way, that's what kept School Days so talked about even to this day. Heck, I'm making this video in 2015, 8 years after it came out. The constant debate of whether or not this is the worst anime ever perpetuates the cycle and gains more new viewers every time. Although most newcomers are going to hate the show because of the reasons previously stated, or because they're hopping on the hate bandwagon with their friends. Either way, the show keeps gaining more exposure. So is School Days the worst anime ever? No, far from it. School Days is a uniquely portrayed harem anime that many misinterpret due to the blind hatred of the main characters. Is the hate warranted? Sure, but it's not nearly deserving of the title as the worst anime ever, nor is it poorly written as people think it is. So the next time you see people hopping on the bandwagon and claiming School Days as the worst anime, show them this video. Maybe they'll actually make legitimate criticism instead of hating on it on superficial levels.